I thought I'd seen everything the road could hand a man. I'd slept under eaves, with rain running through the tiles. I'd woken to dogs tearing at a bundle that turned out to be my breakfast. I'd been stiff with cold on more nights than I can count. But there was a kind of look the road had I had never met, until the night I was chosen, if chosen is the right word. It was January 1st, 1960, New Year's Day, and I was leaving Recife the way I always left cities, with a strap across my shoulder, a leather suitcase bumping against my leg, and a pocket watch heavy in my vest. I sold thread and buttons and other small things folks patch life with. I called myself a traveling salesman, because that was what the bills said, but really I was a man who kept moving because staying still was expensive in a different sort of coin. You learn particular habits when you live like that. You learn to listen to the rhythm of a town before you say its name aloud. You take note of the hours the storekeepers close their shutters, which inns keep a light in the window for late trades, which track of road keeps its dust fine, and which clings like flour. You know the sound of a sugar-cane field at harvest when the wind lays across it. You know your own breathing in the dark. By the time I turned off the main road onto a narrow dirt path, the sugarcane had risen taller than a man on either side. The stalks rubbed together with a paper sound, soft and endless. I kept my satchel closer, felt the weight of the goods in it, felt the familiar ledger folded in the lining. I thought, as I always did, that I'd find somewhere to sit and eat, a stranger's hospitable bench, a small town with a light and a cat in the doorway. That was what I told myself as the sun leaned down and quit. The town I found had one street, 2 or 3 houses, an old store, that Amazem they called it, where men stood when there was news and women mended under the eaves. The owner of the store was a thin man, spoke slow, and kept his eyes on mine when he did. He knew what I was looking for before I asked. He said he had an old house at the edge of the place, empty since the last of the family left the year before. "It's close enough to the road," he said, "and the keys are there. No charge if you keep it warm." People do that sometimes in the country. Offer a house for a night to a stranger in passing. The town lightens the load of a traveller for a small kindness, or because no one wants to see a stranger sleep beside the road with the dogs. He led me down a narrow path that bent into trees, past a well that had no bucket, and onto a yard where the grass had been left long. He offered a hand to lift the latch. The house smelled like old things. That smell, if I have to give it a name, was something like driftwood, cellar air, and a living thing gone sour. The house sat low and stubborn, built of wood that had softened overnight with rain and years, its paint gone thin, and the porch sagging perhaps by half an inch on one side. The door opened with a complaint, a sound like a man waking with a long complaint of the ribs. Inside, the light slanted in through dusty glass. A wooden table leaned under a cloth, a chair tucked to it like a posture remembered, a low bed with a thin mattress. There was a small stove, cold, a kettle with a bit of rust in the lip. I set my satchel down, unhooked my pocket watch, set it on the table. The room felt larger when I moved than when I first entered, and at the center of that size was a silence that pressed against the ears. It was not the usual silence of being alone in a room. It was the kind of silence that listens back. I made a small fire in the stove. I boiled a tin of beans and warmed a piece of bread I'd been saving. The little things steadied me, the hiss of the stove when the flame found the kettle, the clink of the spoon on tin, the small circle of light a lamp makes when you hold it close to your chest. Outside, the sugarcane breathed against itself, and the wind moved like something turning its head to listen. I opened the window a crack, because the air inside had that stale, kept feeling that makes a man think of closed coffins. I left the door ajar by a span so that I might hear if anyone came. Later, that little span of door would feel like a foolishness to me. But in the moment, I told myself I was making sensible choices. A traveller makes 100 sensible choices a night to keep the next morning intact. I folded back the blanket, set my watch to the edge of the table so I could see its face in the dark, and I sat very still for a while, counting the sound of my own heart, and deciding the night would have no more than a tired sleep and the road by dawn. If you like true encounters, if the skin on your neck prickles at stories like this one, stick around and subscribe. There are more nights I could tell you about. I only ask that you keep listening. After that, the house lived in me like a second skin. The quiet thickened, the flame in the stove made its private noises, and the kettle steamed a slow, polite ghost. About an hour after I ate, I heard the first thing that didn't belong. It was a movement outside the room, not quite on the porch, somewhere along the edge of the yard. It was not the light-footed scurry of a small animal, not the clumsy thump of a man stepping on boards. It was a deliberate, measured tread, each beat of it placed as if testing the space, as if the ground itself might answer. I froze. The spoon halted in my hand. The sound hung and the air shifted. I tell you plainly, at that moment I had the strangest certainty that something was walking just beyond the part of the world the light could find. It was close enough that I could count the irregularity of the steps, as if each had its own will, one heavy, one light. A pause, then a series of lighter touches as if whatever it was examining the soil. The smell reached me before any other sign. It is a poor thing to put words to such a thing, but I will try because it anchors my memory where facts fail. The smell was old and wet and iron-rich, like deep mud on a riverbank, and over it there rode an animal stink, musky and thick, and in its edges something like too sweet rot, like a thing that had been dead and kept alive by something else. It crawled under the ribs of the house and sat in my mouth. I pressed myself against the wall, felt the seam of the boards through my shirt, listening. The breathing I heard was not my own. It was long and deep, muffled by the wood, not coming from any throat I could place. There was, too, a scratching. It came slowly at first. A nail dragged, then paused, then dragged again, on the outside of the wall where the wood met the earth, a deliberate punctuation. The sound made the hair at the back of my neck rise. I had heard scratching in barns, rats, the occasional stray dog, but this was the sound of something testing, of something trying to read the house by touch. There were 100 cheap stories told in the stores. I knew them as well as any man of my trade. Stories of the countryside's restless things, the way doors are touched on certain nights, the idea that sometimes a thing will pass by, wishing to be left in peace. I had laughed at them before. I had told myself that the road is a place for superstitions because it is the place of lonely men who try to make sense of too many small miseries. But when the noise at the wall changed and a breath came close enough to stir the powder on the sill, the ledger in my satchel seemed suddenly worthless and my confidence like old cloth. You learn habits of survival in little everyday ways. You learn to breathe with the house, to time your steps to the sway of boards, to keep still so you can hear. I slid the spoon to the edge of the table and let it keep its tin whisper, and then I went to the door and shut the gap I had left. I moved as quietly as a man who has watched many other men do things loudly. My fingers closed the latch with the least sound possible. Once the door was latched, I sat down in the darkest corner of the room where the fire threw the least answer. I thought of God a little, in the way men do when they think of accounts. A quick look, and then a return to business. I thought of my mother, and the way she would have worried if she could see me. No doubt she would have told me to keep walking until daylight. But that was not always practical, with a satchel of wares and a pocket of coins with holes in it. Anyhow, the thing at the wall did not move away. It stayed. It made a sound then that I swear to this day tried to mimic the cadence of a man's voice without words, guttural syllables pulled low from something that had not learned the measure of language, an attempt at conversation that was all rasp and guesswork. It was not singing. It was as if the thing had a mouth and was trying on sounds like a man might try on a hat. The house answered only with its own creaks. The silence between each of those rough syllables seemed to stretch and expand until the room filled with nothing but expectation. I have a poor memory for faces now, but I can name the taste of fear I had then. It was copper on the tongue. It sat there while I clutched at the edge of the table, thinking about the light outside, about whether a man could stand such waiting and be unchanged. I recall, too, that old silly thought, if you can call it thought, that perhaps if I kept myself like a thing, I might be seen as uninteresting and be left alone. So I breathed as quiet as a mouse. Time does funny things in moments like that. The pocket watch said it was late, the hour hand half bent over the minute. But time did not move with the watch's polite ticks. It stretched until my bones felt long. Every little sound became a whole story. A mouse in the eaves sounded like someone walking the roof. A groan from the chair sounded like a man moving. My hearing sharpened. My hunger withdrew. The flame in the stove grew into a small world of its own, and then was insufficient, and then the world outside would not be answered. There were other sounds besides the steps and the scratching, small, careful things that I could only call testing. The thing walked round the house once in a slow circumference, and I heard the soft catch of something on the earth, like hands raking the soil for a shape. Later, when I could stand to look again, I would find lines these movements left in the dirt outside, parallel grooves, depressions of something heavy. But at that hour, I could only sit and imagine them. At one point, the creature pressed itself to the door and breathed, and I felt the shock of it as if wind had been forced through a narrow gap. The breath had the taste of iron and old leaves. There was something that smelled like sun-warmed meat. It was wrong. It felt wrong. I remember a sudden foolishness, an urge to speak, to say something that might mark me as a man and not an animal. I cleared my throat, and my voice came out as a small sound, a child's apology. The thing outside answered with a rough noise that suggested it had understood, which made the hair on my arms prickle as if I had been seen naked. For a moment, I thought I heard a word, or something like a word, formed as an experiment. A low, a sound of consideration. I do not know whether it tried to say my name, or only to make the practice of a name. The possibility itself felt like a judgment. If you have been a traveling man as long as I have, you collect things besides goods. You have a few people you see in every town. The store owner who gave me the house had told me the day before in the easy gossip of men that the place had been empty since the family left. An old woman had come by with a basket of mangoes and had said nothing, only watched me tighten the strap of the satchel. There was a drunk sitting on a stool beneath the eaves who muttered that there were nights that made your skin crawl, and he had tapped his knee as if keeping a slow beat and said, "They like those nights." I had smiled then in the way a man smiles who intends to seem unsurprised. That smile had been warm and cheap. As the night grew longer and the thing moved like a slow ambition along the perimeters of the house, those brief moments of familiarity became the last bright, foolish things to cling to me. At some point, the sound at the wall shifted from testing to marking. The scratching came in a line, a series of deep letters carved in the wood, and the sound carried through like someone writing with the nails of a slow hand. If a man has never heard wood cried at by something with a heavy paw or a heavy need, then I am poor with comparisons, but it is what it was. The wood answered faintly, thin with the old paint cracking and falling into the night. I imagined the marks later, deep, ragged lines that would not be there for talk alone. I imagined them as promises. There was a small thing that drove me more than anything else, a feeling of being observed from a place outside the world of sight, as if the house were a bowl and something had its face cupped around it and was testing to see what life looked like inside. When something watches you not to eat you, but to know you, the weight of it is heavier. It is a patience that is hungry in a different way. It is learning the shape of you. The thing was not clumsy, it was deliberate. That is the part that kept me from sleep, that thought that it was not only hungry but curious, and that curiosity had a patience larger than my own endurance. I tried to remember the folk sayings that might give me comfort. The men in the Armor's M had told stories in the afternoons, short, dry tales about cattle found with their throats untorn and their eyes empty, about dogs howling at nothing and men waking with scratches on their arms and no explanation. There was the woman who came in with a mended skirt, who swore she had seen a tall shadow on the town's edge that stood up on two legs and watched, and then bent down like a dog and licked its own hands. There was always a half-speech in these accounts, a kind of hush that made the stories more important. The old drunk had said, "They choose." He said it as if it were a weather report. Listen. All night long there was a rhythm to my terror, a step, then the hush, too loud, a breath, then a slow scrape. I tried to think of things I had done before the road made its appetite my life. A girl's face in a market, a bowl of caldo shared at an inn, a ledger filled with small trades. Those memories became my armor. I repeated them, soft like prayer, to keep the noise away. The thing answered by drawing a round on the porch and stopping where the light from the cellar window met the earth. It pressed against the house and did not go. Once through a crack in the boards where the porch met the wall, I thought I saw motion. I will not say I saw a face. I did not see one in the way your eye picks a man's face and counts its features. I saw a shape of a thing, the outline of shoulders heavier than a man's, the suggestion of a head that was too thick for its neck. It moved slow as a thought. It smelled. There are scents you will carry forever. I carry the smell of that night like a small coin in my pocket. I did not scream. I did not call for help. What good would that have been? There was no help to call. I had no gun, no friend. A man on the road learns to live without such measures because they weigh you down, and because the world is too large for your troubles sometimes. I only pressed myself lower against the wall and let the house be my body. My breath was a thing I kept secret. It seemed to me then that my life had shrunk into the small private mechanics of keeping breath below a threshold. Hours went like that, a hunted patience. The thing outside would move, would test, would leave me with the sound impression of something pondering. Now and then it would do a sound that I cannot quite put into the shape of a syllable, an attempt at mimicry, low like a throat trying to remember a song. It was crude and terrible in its effort. There was, too, something that I suppose I must call intelligence. The way it worked the space, the way it seemed to push air through cracks to see which way a man drew it in, the way it paused where the window catch rested. These things rid to me like a mind not merely of violence, but of comprehension. When morning came, when the sky paled and the sugar-cane stopped its scratch and the birds began their small, clumsy conversations, the presence eased, not gone. Only withdrawn to a measure that gave me an opening to crawl, to make life press again into my limbs. The light in the room was thin, and all the small things were asleep in grey. The first thing I noticed was not the marks on the wall, but the smell. It lingered, heavy and reluctant, as if the night had left a blanket there, and the sun was not yet brave enough to take it up. I will tell what I remember of the break of day later. For now, know only that the night had done its work. But I am getting ahead of myself in memories scatter. What I ought to tell now is how living like a travelling man leaves its own scars, how those earlier, lesser nights stretched me in a way that made me susceptible to this one. There were long seasons of hitching goods from place to place, of setting a chair in the store to add up sales, of learning faces by their hands' calluses. I once slept 2 nights in a canoe on a river between towns. I woke to a rain that had washed the sound out of the world, and felt briefly that I could have belonged to water instead of to the road. Another time, I shared a table at an inn with a teacher who had a way of telling stories in very small, measured sentences. I remember him because he spoke of a place where the wind always smelled like oranges, and where loneliness had a different face. These things are spare and tidy, and they kept me the kind of man who would take other people's houses when the road asked. I will tell you, too, the small talk that prefaced the night, the store owner's hand on my arm, the woman's wordless glance, the drunk's muttered beat. Each one of those small things came back to me as the house's noises filled the dark. There are lives a man picks up on travels, a child's laugh bought with a spool of thread, a woman's gratitude for a mended skirt, a friendly soup at a corner that would laugh when you left money short because you were a familiar face. Those small debts are ledger lines in the memory. They sustain a man until the world takes its heavier toll. Sitting in the corner, I thought of those accounts as a man counts pennies. I thought that perhaps my seeing this would make me a teller to others. I thought I would be able to speak of the night without breaking into a tender place. I was wrong about that. The thing at the house did something at the last hour before dawn that I have not told many men, because the memory makes my voice thin. It moved to the back of the porch and scratched there in a steady, slow pattern. It used something, perhaps its claws, perhaps a stone, to leave a continuous line along the wood where the house met the foundation. The rhythm of the scratching was patient and slow, like a man carving a prayer into a tomb. I could hear each scrape like a sentence. When it stopped, the thing made a sound that was almost a sigh, and then an inhale so deep and so close I felt the small hairs at my wrist lift. It did not try the door then. It did not engage in a blunt way it might have. It stood and listened. Then, as if considering the merit of the house and the man inside it, it turned away with a measured animal certainty and rode off into the cane in a way that made the ground's whisper linger. The cane closed back together as if a hand had smoothed it. The breath of it remained in the room like smoke. I did not sleep after that. I lay awake with my hand on my satchel and my watch ticking like proof that things counted. I thought for a long time of the old drunk's words. They choose. What does it mean to be chosen by a thing that is neither wholly human nor wholly beast? I had no answer. What I had was a mark inside my rib, an unease that would not settle. The sun rose thin and white. Birds began, in a disorganized chorus, to claim the morning. The smell hung. The house seemed taller in the light, its imperfections more honest. At the first clear light, I stepped to the door. The latch creaked in a way I had never heard before, resonant and uneasy. I put my hand on the knob, and with a care borrowed from a man who had learned to respect small divergences between ordinary and dangerous, I opened the door a finger's width and peered out. The yard was empty, no footprints of another man, but near the foundation, the wood where the creature had scratched was marked deeply, gouges in the grain that had not been there when I came in. The lines were fresh, raw. They went from the baseboard down to the soil, and then into the dirt in a pattern that was not like boot prints or hoof tracks. They were heavy depressions, circular and regular in a way that suggested weight and a stride that either walked like a man or did not. I remember the way the light made the dust in the air visible, like slow motes turning in a shaft of a sermon. The smell rose again as I stepped outside, and it sat on my hands. It was then I noticed the shape of the ground where the thing had moved. A series of indentations that looked like pads but too large, and between them the smearing of something like hairs, left as if someone brushed it on purpose. I will not swear to the exactness of what I saw then, except that later, when I told folks in the Armazem, they fell quiet, and the thin man pressed a hand to his mouth. The old drunk said nothing that morning. He only stared and tapped his knee twice and walked away. I stooped and ran my fingers along one of the scrapes in the wood. It had the ridged feel of a claw's work, notched and raw. The skin along my knuckles tightened at the smell. It was a living smell, meaning it had warmth and the tang of iron and the suggestion of age like a coin with handling. I cannot tell you how many times since that day I have tried to dry the sense of that smell from my life. You cannot. It adheres. There were other marks. A shallow furrow traced around the porch where something had nosed with a weight that bent the soil. I saw where the cane had been trampled in a small, strange circle. And there were more subtle things, half-eaten tufts of cane, as if something had used them to clean itself, small drops of darkened liquid smeared on a stone, as if to sign the place. These things were not the work of a common animal. They were the careful practice of some presence that knew how to leave evidence without revealing itself entirely. I gathered my satchel and did not sleep in that house again. I had no mind to sit and wait for anything more than the proof of morning. I left without taking the stir of the town into my chest. I moved like a man who had been shown two faces of the same country and could not reconcile them. The village, when I stopped by the Amazem to speak, shrank into itself. The thin man kept his hands in his pockets. The woman who mended skirt raised her head and did not look at me. The old drunk was gone. The boy who tended cattle shifted his hat on his head and watched the ground. When I told them what I had seen and smelled, their faces did not go to disbelief. Instead, they told their own details, small corroborations like fish bones of the bigger truth. The thing that has made me keep this night in the way I do is that what I saw was not an attack in the way you picture an animal attacking. It was a test and a marking, an engagement that did not end in claws through my chest. It made me understand, painfully, that some things in the world are not content to visit once. They do not merely take, they choose. They put a small piece of their presence on you and leave. As I walked away that morning with the satchel heavier in a new way, I remember feeling small in the field, but watched in a different manner. The cane along the path brushed my sleeve and seemed to whisper in sympathy. The road ahead was dust and narrow, and it would shake the soles of my shoes later that day. I kept thinking of the hand on the latch and the scrape in the wood, and the way the thing had tested the house as if considering whether to leave me spared. I knew then, even before dusk, that the story was not done. The tracks it left beyond the house had a pattern, and some part of me, late, stubborn, foolish, wanted to follow them, to see whether the path they made led to a clearing or to a secret. It is strange how a man can be both terrified and drawn at once. The country keeps a thread in your chest that tugs you towards stories you do not want to tell. I did not intend to follow that thread that day. I promised myself I would go to the next town and sell my wares and keep my head down. But the rastro it made, heavy and measured, laid itself like a question across the road. My feet, which had worked the world for years, found the line as if it had been a scent they recognized. I will stop here for a moment, because there is a particular place where memory is a rack, and the event slants in ways that even now I cannot smooth. It was the first night that the road gave me a silence that listened back, and the first morning I realized I could not put that silence behind me simply by walking away. The rest of what I did, how I followed, what I found at the fork in the road, the clearing where things became even more clear and yet less explainable, will come. For now, remember this. When a thing like that marks you, it does not always leave with violence. Sometimes it leaves with an imprint, an invitation, and the knowledge that you will not be the same man who first walked into its path. I said I would not follow that day, and for a while I meant it. I walked to the next town, with the satchel like a small, obedient animal at my side, asked after trade, set a spool of thread on the plank where the man at the door might see it, and nod, counted my coins as if they could be a border against what had happened. But the mark the night left had weight beyond coin. It sat in my ribs like a stone and tugged. By mid-afternoon, the road had shown me the same line it always had, the soft, dusty stitch of a trail that led back toward the place where the cane had closed. But now each footfall seemed to answer some question below my skin. When the sun tilted low, I found myself turning from the main road and taking the narrow track the thing had used. My hands were steady, but my heart kept finding new ways to complain. You must understand the feel of that path. It did not look like anything a man might lay out. It was a question written in the soil. Pairs of depressions set in a rhythm that suggested a heavy foot, followed by a light pad. A pause, then another heavy set, as if the gaits of two creatures were stitched together into one strange step. The grass between the indents lay flat, as if a palm had smoothed it, and the air over the line smelled of the same iron and rot breath I had known in the house. At times the scent rose in plumes so dense it felt like stepping through a curtain. I followed it because something in me needed to see where it had come from, and because a man who sells small repairs also owes himself the truth of how the world wears. It was late when I left the village for that path. The thin man at the armazem watched me tighten my strap, and did not offer words beyond the old curt nod. The woman with the mending cloth looked out from under her brow and said softly, "Be careful in the cane." That is not quite a warning. It is a shape of care they have there, where people measure danger by the length of their silence rather than by loud counsel. The cattle boy spat twice and said he would not walk that way after sundown. The drunk, who sometimes knows things because he is permitted to speak the truth when sober men would be punished for it, tapped his knee in that slow rhythm and looked at me with a kind of pity that felt like a verdict. "You shouldn't follow what follows you," he said, with more clarity than I have seen him muster for years. But he tapped his knee and then laughed, and that laugh had no warmth. The trail led me through the cane until the stalks closed over the path like curtains. The light inside the green was thin, a sheen on leaves, and the sound the stalks made was not wind then, but some long joining of reeds rubbing, a susurration that seemed to talk back to the footfalls. The rastro, if you will let me keep the old word, kept its own company. Occasionally I would step wrong and feel the earth give in a way that made me look at my toes for a man-shaped print instead of a pad. Once I reached down and ran my fingers along a groove and felt hair caught in the soil, coarse and stiff, as if the thing had rubbed against a tree and left a sample of itself like a calling card. My fingers came away smelling like iron and the dark sweetness of something half-rotted. That smell has a way of rooting itself into memory. Even now, I can bring it into my mouth. At a fork in the path, the line divided. The two tracks lay like a question split into two sentences, each path inviting, each path denying. One veered toward a low rise where an old well stood, mossed over and half open to the sky. The other took a lower course into a hollow, where the cane bent and pooled like water, and the homes were rare and scattered. For reasons I could not name then, and cannot entirely name now, I felt myself turn toward the hollow. The other path felt like the safe measure, higher land, open to sun and the moon, easier to be seen from. The hollow had an intimacy to it, a promise of secrecy. I tell you plainly, the pull was not rational. It was as if something within me answered to the line carved near my porch, as if following was not a choice, but a fulfilling of a question the night had posed. I walked that hollow with the kind of caution a man has when he knows he is doing something neither brave nor foolish, but necessary. The cane brushed my shoulders like hands, sometimes hard, sometimes caressing. In the hollow the sky thinned strange, streaked with late light that did not warm so much as illuminate like a trade lantern. The path narrowed, and then widened again. At times I thought I heard that breathing behind me, slow and patient and pleased. I would stop, press my ear to the air, and then nothing would be there but the small private noises of my own body, and the far-off clink of a cowbell where a distant herd grazed. There were moments, small and sharp, when memory folded on itself. I thought of a man I had met in a port town who kept a herd of parrots and who lost them all in a single night to a storm. The man had sat across from me and spoken in the small, measured sentences that travellers often use for safety. And yet even his polite voice had some tremor when he told the story. "You must give them a name," he had said, as if naming made the loss less obscene. I thought of that as I walked, naming the path, naming the thing, as if words could offer me the same small armor I used in barter. But words that night held little weight against the breath along the trail. The path bent, and then it opened to a stand of trees, a bit of land where the cane could not take root. The ground changed under my boots. It was softer and reeked of loam. There were circles there, pressed grass and flattened leaves where the creature had turned, and around those circles the cane lay down as if bowed. In the center of one of those rings lay objects the thing had arranged in a way that made me think of offerings, though I do not know to whom or what. Stones placed in a loose line, a small pile of broken cane, a strip of fabric I did not recognize, stained and old. The stones had been turned so their flat faces looked toward the clearing. I moved slowly because the motion of approaching felt like giving a speech in a place that did not accept flattery. I will not say the thing waited for me there. I will say that the clearing had been prepared in a manner that suggested deliberation, as if whoever or whatever had wandered there had arranged a place for an appointment and left the room tidy for its return. The air in the clearing was heavier still, as if it had been sitting in a cup, and my breathing made a small boat in that weight. I felt watched in a way that was not about vision alone. The watching came like warmth on the back of the neck, as if someone had their palm near my shoulder. I heard a low sound then, a roll of something like a rumble and a sigh together, and I understood that the thing was there, close enough that it placed its presence like a hand on my life. There was a moment I will never convince any sober man to accept. I felt the thing measure me. It was like a tailor taking the sweep of a man's sleeve, not with hands, but with the way it moved air around me, the way it let the cane bend and then not. It was a weighing that did not end in blow or in embrace, only in an acceptance. I have tried to find the word for that feeling. Marked will have to do. You can imagine a brand. It is more subtle than that. It was as if something had rubbed against my skin and left a thin trail of cold that would not warm. Later, I found a set of light scratches along my forearm, small parallel marks that stung when the wind pressed against them. At the time, I thought I had brushed a thorn. Afterwards, I knew otherwise. There was no thorn on the road to match the precise rhythm of those lines. The creature did not come fully into the clearing in the way a man steps into a room. It remained at the rim, a shadow that altered the air more than it changed the light. Once more, I attempted to tell myself I had been foolish to follow, that the road is a place that plays tricks on tired men, that sleep and stew had warped my mind. Then the sound, the low testing sound that had tried to be a word, rippled through the hollow and seemed to touch my name. Whether it named me or read the shape of me I cannot say. It was not a voice speaking as you and I speak. It was a scraping of meaning, a sound that selected from me a memory and returned it as if to say, "I have looked." It did not threaten. It did not call me its own. It only made evident that some exchange had taken place. I had been seen, and something had decided I would be kept in account. I knelt then, not from fear, but from the sense that the earth asked a courtesy. I laid my palm on the soft soil and tasted it in the nose, humus, clay, the scent of old things. And the thing made a nascent sound that might have been contentment. It moved without ever entering the circle in the way a hand moves across the face of a sleeping child. The hair along my arms lifted in a chill that held both terror and an odd solace. There was, beneath everything, a feeling like gratitude. It will be hard for some to hear that word in this story, gratitude towards something that could have undone me. But there it was, a grudging respect perhaps, or recognition of some ancient order that lays hands on those who wander into its path. I do not know if it is right to say I bargained with it. I would not have named it bargaining at the time. It was smaller, a brief private pact held in silence. If the creature took pleasure in the sight of me trembling, it hid that pleasure with a posture of grave indifference. It left me with one clear thing, and I will try to say it as plainly as I can. It wanted me to remember. It wanted me to carry its scent and its mark and its knowledge like a coin in my pocket. I suppose that was its way of marking territory. Perhaps it was some older, stranger ritual. Whatever it was, the act had consequence. I felt, as the clearing held its own breath, a pressing along my hand, like a leaf brushed down. And then the thing withdrew, the cane folded, and the hollow was once more ordinary, except for the lines left on my skin and the way the air tasted of iron. I walked away from that field with a slow gait, as if my legs were learning a new step. The scratches on my arms smarted, and the smell clung like salt. I would later try to scrub it with soap until my hands were raw, and still that scent would cling to the bed of my nostrils. For days afterward I would wake and find it like a small animal asleep on my coat. People noticed it before I spoke. At the next Armazem I sat in the corner, and when I put down my satchel, the thin man did not ask where I had been. He only watched the line on my sleeve, and then raised an old eyebrow. The mender woman abandoned her needle for a second, and placed her palm on my wrist with a kindness that made me ashamed. "You carry more than thread now," she said. That was not accusation. It was understanding, as if the village had a grammar for these things, and the sentence to explain them. After that walk, nights were no longer private. Small sounds hunched at the edge of sleep. I received visits in my dreams that were not dreams as much as memories rearranged. The cane moving without wind, the heavy step not distant, but like a neighbor in the next room. Sometimes I would wake with my hands scratched, as if in the night I had tried to claw the thing away. Sometimes my dreams were generous in detail. I would find myself back at the clearing watching the stones, and the thing would stand beyond the rim and regard me as if waiting for a coin to be offered. On slow afternoons years later, I would think of that desire to follow and cringe at the memory of my own curiosity. I told the village what I had seen, as much as a man can tell the truth without giving it too many parts to be mistaken for boasting or madness. The thin man told me stories then that widened what I thought I knew. When he was a boy, his father had come across a pasture where the grass had been laid flat in a perfect circle, and in that circle the cattle were found calm and untouched, though bled. A woman passing by told of a friend who returned from a night on the road with a ring of white hairs braided into the cuffs of his coat. No one could say why, but the man smelled like a stable for weeks and kept the braid until he died. The drunk told a tale that was muddled and half true about a man who woke to find 3 small notches on his door and then left town without his boots. They told these stories quietly, like prayers, and when they shared them a shape took form. This was not unique to me. It was not an isolated appetite. I asked them why the thing would spare a man. The old drinker tapped his knee twice, as if marking the rhythm of something older than both of us. "They choose," he repeated in a voice that had shed liquor for gravity. "Maybe they choose for need. Maybe they choose for the look on a man's face. Maybe—" And here he made a small squint, as if the answer vanished in a thought. "Maybe they choose because there must be witnesses." The thin man sniffed and said nothing else. The cattle boy muttered that dogs go quiet where the thing goes, and sometimes the cattle are found staring into empty spaces until the farmer grows thin. These stories are small and tall at once. They do not say much, they say enough. For a while, I tried to turn my life toward trade as if nothing had happened. I set up my small stall in morning markets and pinned my wares neat. Buttons lined up like tiny moons, thread wound like little suns. People bought and bartered, and my hands were busy counting and folding and tying. But strangers looked at me differently. Women paused and touched the linen of a shirt, and then looked at the line on my arm. Men who had once joked with me over a packet of needles now lowered their voices when they spoke of late nights. A man changed slowly under that kind of attention, not all at once, but as a stew cools. I found my laughter thinned. I found myself watching the edges of the town, as if expecting the cane to rise through the planks and step into the square. There were other small things that happened across the seasons. Animals left without explanation, dogs found with their eyes unseeing, a horse collapsed in a field with no wound, but with the look of one who had seen a long road and had chosen not to finish it. Once a boy came into the Amazem with a matted scrap of fur and eyes too big for his face and handed it to me. He said his dog had come home like that after a night by the river, and he wanted to know if I could mend its collar. I smoothed that fur in my palm and thought of the hair I had found on the path. I kept the scrap wrapped in an envelope for a time, and then burned it one evening when the smell got too close to the bed. People do what they can with fear in a small town. They tell each other not to walk alone at night. They leave lights in their windows and cross themselves in the doorway. They light small fires to chase the chill that is not of the weather. Once, on a market day years after that first night, a stranger walked into the square with a strange look on his face and asked bluntly about the cane road to the west. The thin man at the Amazem watched him and said nothing for a long while, and then told him in low words to go no farther than sundown. The stranger left with a quick step, the kind of one men use when running from remembrance. These are the small acts that prove there is a story shared, without the need for men to build a monument out of it. There is a practical thing to say here. After you have been marked by something like that, the choices you make are different. I found roads I had walked my whole life to be different passages of daylight. The sound of wind in reeds made me stop sometimes and listen, thinking the rhythm might be counting out the days I had been given. I avoided certain paths because the memory of the scent made my hand twitch toward a knife I did not own. I went to sleep with songs in my head I had not sung before, and woke with the sensation of being observed, even in a bed that had known only warmth and lace. Simple life became intricate. Buying a cup of coffee turned into a small measurement of courage. I began to collect stories as much as other men collect coins. For a long while it was my way of measuring not only the world outside, but the world inside me. Each tale I heard from a villager became a mirror placed at a small angle so that the same truth could be seen from different sides. There was the teacher at the inn, the one I had mentioned earlier in small pieces, who had told me of a road that always smelled like oranges, and where people said you could hear the dead humming. He had a soft mouth, and he told the story slow, as if testing a possibility. He told of a man in his town who returned from that road with the look of a man who has been at sea too long. His hands had changed, he said. They had the look of a man's who had been taught by animals. Another woman offered a whispered memory of a neighbor who used to keep a candle burning on the windowsill because he believed the light would keep what listened at bay. These are the little testimonies of a country that learns to live beside things. It neither wholly names nor entirely denies. There were nights I tried to make jokes of it, telling a younger traveling man that the road had only given me a new smell to sell, and that the thing had promised me a discount on bad weather. He laughed then, with a sound that had some relief to it and some cruelty. It is remarkable how laughter functions. It is a pressure valve and a brittle shield. We laughed then, and then went our separate ways. He saw me later on, months after, on a market day, and then his laughter had quieted. He crossed to the other side of the stall, and the space between us was measured like a good distance for safety. I've been asked in fits and starts whether I would go back to the clearing. The answer is both yes and no. Curiosity that night kept me from being a simple man. Once it tasted of the field, it refused to leave me as a mere passer-by. But there is a prudence that grows in a man when he collects a mark. Not all return to places that wounded or changed them. I've walked the line again years later, more in memory than in body. And sometimes in the morning market I will find a child under a table listening to my stories, with eyes wide and not yet old. I watch that child and see how the road looks now, how rumour creeps into the bone and becomes slow as a habit. One thing I will not claim is that I was given a blessing or cursed. Words like those belong to men who like tidy ends. What I will say is that my life was altered. The world grew edges in places I had believed to be soft. The silence began to listen for me. I learned to put down a kettle and listen not only for a knock, but for the way the wind arranged itself like a mouth in a conversation just beyond hearing. I think now that the marking was less about my usefulness as prey than about my capacity to remember and tell. The thing seemed to know that the road is made whole by those who carry stories between towns. Perhaps that is why it chose me and not another. Perhaps it chose so another would not bear the tale. I do not know. In the long months that followed the first year, when the season changed and the cane cut back and the road stripped itself bare, I noticed that other men who had brushed close to that pattern altered too. A farmer would leave for the city and return with the air of a man who had seen coal, and a girl who once smiled in the market now kept her chin low. The village arranged itself around these small changes. No one built a monument. No one wrote a notice. They bared their teeth to the world in softer ways. Respect is the thing they chose, less spectacle, more protocol. When a stranger asked the way to the fields, they prepared their faces to speak nothing but the safety of daylight. I do not tell this story for a kind of thrill. I tell it because I will not be able to keep the memory from shifting the weight of my days if I do not. The night taught me to notice the small things, the way a flap of cloth in a doorway moved when a thing that is not a wind passed by, the little line of hair on a fence post, a bloodless smear on a stone. It taught me that being seen is not always the end of a story. Sometimes it is the beginning of one. The mark a thing leaves is an agreement of sorts. It assures you that you remain capable of attention and that you can carry burden and witness in equal measure. Some nights, when I lie awake and the house creaks in the winter way, I think I hear the slow, satisfied step that will never come on my porch again. Sometimes the smell returns to me in the steam of my tea, and I pause with the cup halfway to my mouth until the ghost of that scent fades. I've been asked if I feel gratitude for having been spared. Perhaps a man spared ought to feel gratitude, but there is an ache that sits under that gratitude. The knowledge that spared does not mean unmarked. I carry those lines on my arm like a tally, and they remind me of the price of being seen. I have learned to tell the story in small pieces. At markets I keep it concise. At a table with a boy who listens with the honesty of youth, I can say more. I have told it to weary travellers in inns with more solace than spectacle. Some listen and nod as if recalling their own seam of fear. Others scoff and say the mind will play tricks in the dark. That is fair. The world allows many truths to stand next to each other because it is hospitable to contradiction. You may decide if you wish that a tired man told you this tale for attention. That is your right. I will keep the part of the night that is mine and not yours. As for the creature, as for what the village calls a werewolf, these words are shorthand. The field has names for its ghosts, and men lend their old languages where the new one fails. You may call it what your family calls such a shape. You may call it a thing of the woods, an ancient tenant of the cane, or a story the land tells itself at night. I will not pretend to know its origin nor its end. I will not say whether it belongs to an age before our own, or whether it is born from some small cruelty we have allowed the world. All I will promise is this. It exists in the way my arm bears its scratches, and in the way the air tastes of iron when I pass certain folds of land. That is enough for me, is enough. If you are a man who likes hard answers, you will be disappointed. If you are a listener who keeps an eye and a nose open, you might learn a small thing from my account. Do not be too quick to walk away from the things that watch you, and do not be too quick to follow them either. There is wisdom in both restraint and curiosity, and both will bruise a man in different ways. Before I finish, there are a few small stories I owe as a kind of ledger balance, the way a man will add small sums to make the account appear even. There was once a woman from a village nearer the river who heard a sound at midnight like children chanting and found that in the morning her chickens had lined themselves in a perfect ring. She swore the next day that they had been given a sermon and had listened. There was a man who kept his sheep in a fold, and one morning found them unbothered, but with bits of cane woven into their wool. No sign of teeth, no sign of strain, only the artistry of something that had been fussy. Once a teacher who had been a soldier told me of men who returned to the barracks with their boots turned inside out and their eyes full of the sea. Men who would not sleep with a candle, but who kept a stone in their hands until morning, as if it were a talisman. Each tale is small. Each bears the same weight. Some things enter our nights and leave patterns. These stories are not meant to frighten you into running from the road. They are meant to make you remember to look. The road is not a thing you pass through and forget. It is an alphabet of small signs, if you know how to read them. I have learned that much. I have learned to notice where dogs will not go, where animals will not graze, where the cane lies flat in a line too neat to be wind. I have learned that a sleeping place is a kind of citizen and must be treated with respect. There are nights I go back in memory to the clearing and sit there without moving, and I feel the hand of that thing, if you prefer the blunt language, or the attention of the land. I cannot say I am grateful for being chosen in the old pious way. I am not sure that word fits. I am only sure that I remember and that I have been made to remember. That is the story I bring to you now, as the years have faded the color of the cane and made the names of the men I met less precise. The memory itself remains, a skeleton of smell and sound, and the rare and terrible imposition of being watched. If this tale has found a place in you, if your skin prickled at the parts I told plainly and not for theatrics, if you carry a memory of some quiet road that watched you, then you know the small and private cost of wandering. There are roads that will mend you, and there are roads that will mark you. Both roads are honest in their way. I do not close with a promise that you will believe me. I close with a simple asking, remember the quiet places. If you travel, keep your eyes and your nose and your ears open. And if by some chance you have a memory like mine, an encounter that left you less whole but more aware, then tell it. Tell it to a neighbor, to a stranger on a bench, to a child who has not yet learned the names of fear. The world needs witnesses, even when the witnesses are tired. Share the story, so it can be measured alongside others. Tell it plainly. Tell it as you remember it, and let the town decide what to do with the truth. If you have a story like this one, if you have felt the same cold press of a breath you could not place, or seen the same circle where the grass lies flat, write it below. Tell us where the road looked at you and how you answered. We listen here. We keep each other's memory because it helps us understand what the night is willing to be. Thank you for listening to my story, to the night that chose me, and to the road that taught me how to tell it.